good evening, or it seems like afternoon, and welcome. I'm Gloria Palmer. I'm the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. And I want to thank you all for being here and thank you for your continued participation in our programs on Zoom, as well as any of you who have made a donation to Green Mountain Academy. We rely on the support of our donors to cover the costs that are not covered just by your registration fees alone. So thank you for that. Today's presenter is Doreen Schmid. She is a Manchester-based curator, writer, and editor, and adjunct professor who teaches art history courses, including Renaissance to Contemporary and History of Photography at the Napa Valley College. She has curated exhibitions in California, Italy, and Qatar, and edited award-winning catalogs and books for organizations including the NEA. Co-author of Oyster Culture, Doreen writes for publications including Photograph, Lens Culture, and Interventions. She has been keeping and studying bees for 15 years and is working on a bee-based exhibition that includes some of the work featured in her presentation. Current projects include using archival photographs as the basis for a fictionalized narrative, contextualizing the lives of Anglo-Irish colonial wives and the confluence of history and memory, time and image. We're absolutely thrilled to have you here with us, Doreen. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria, and Green Mountain Academy and everyone here tonight for this opportunity to share some buzz about bees with you. We're looking at a really wide span of bee art, starting with the ancient spiritual origins of our relationship to and with bees, early illustrations, the medieval Catholic patron saint of bees and beekeepers, Saint Abigail, German Renaissance painter Albrecht Dürer, and into the contemporary arts, visual, including the historic photographic process tintypes, sculptural, literary, musical, and dance. Dance is based on the bee's famous navigational waggle dance. Textiles in the form of crocheting by two women artists, emblematic, of course, of bees' domesticity, and sculptural work using beeswax, apisculpture. And here's the part where bees collaborate with, as the artists like to say, the artist. Interleaved, interwoven with all this are some fun facts and photos about bee life, such as pollinating. We'll end with a short look at how can we help save the bees and loop back to the spiritual place where we started. Phew. Bees are industrious and so shall be we, so come along with me. What you're looking at here is a frame of pollen from a hive that I once had. And just what colors, what a pattern. I want to make wallpaper out of it. It's uncapped pollen mixed with some bee spit and nectar or honey, and it will be capped and fermented into bee bread. This is what the hive is fed for the most part. Humans like bee pollen too, of course, along with honey and royal jelly, and we have myriad uses for wax. An easy place to start with bees is how obviously they're contextualized in relationship to humans, by how ubiquitous they are in our vernacular communication. That busy as a bee again, you're the bee's knees, honey bun, sweet as honey. In song, sugar pie, honey bunch, be my little baby bumblebee. The beehive has long served as a model, a metaphor for social utopia, an orderly, industrious, and harmonious collective social unit benefiting man. Conversely, bees are associated with dark, destructive, and blindly instinctual behavior, representing uncontrollable nature, which man fears. To simplify, bees are sweet and scary, two things to which humans are greatly attracted. These seemingly freewheeling, fuzzy creatures buzzing around, gathering nectar, actually function according to a rigid set of rules within the ultimate cubicle of the hive. We even call the compartments in the hive cells. This opposition forms a dialectic, and this perpetual tension, I think, is some of what makes bees such a perennially fascinating and inspiring subject for artists who choose to work with them, with bee byproducts, comb, pollen, honey, and live bees in a variety of media. George Eliot had a sweet spot, no pun intended, for bees, but for the point of wisdom, I would choose to know the mind that stirs between the wing of bees. George Eliot wasn't the only one enamored of bees. Virgil was as well. The Georgics meaning farming, in his book 4, Beekeeping, Apiculture, 29 BCE, is a paean to bees. It's like one long poem, a short excerpt. For some supervise the gathering of food and work in the fields to an agreed rule. Some, walled in their homes, lay the first foundations of the comb with drops of gum taken from narcissi and sticky glue from tree bark, then hang the clinging wax. Others lead the mature young, their nation's hope. Others pack purest honey together and swell the cells with liquid nectar. Here we have an early illustration, the swarming of the bees from much later, early for us, but not as early as 29 BCE, Virgil's time. This is by Wenceslaus Hollar, 17th century illustration again. And we will now get into another idea propagated by Virgil and others at the time, which is begonia, the mistaken idea that bees germinate in, generate from bulls' carcasses, as we see on the left. On the right, we see a slightly scary image of a contemporary artist who is obviously channeling Virgil's idea of begonia. What was this thought? It was believed that honeybees emerged from ox carcasses or bulls after they were split open. The swarm was new life emanating from death, a belief that links bees to both the natural world and the underworld. Another contradiction and opposition here. Egyptians believed that bees were human spirits that could fly anywhere. The ancient Zoroastrian symbol for spirit was bees. Jungians today believe dreams of bees represent the spirit. When we talk about the spirit of bees, we're talking about a concept that's quite well documented. This is one of the seminal texts, early texts on bees, the bee in Greek mythology. If we scroll down to the mid part here, possesses 14 bodies of bees in gold of late Etruscan workmanship. Below that, we see 300 golden bees found along with an ox head of gold in the tomb of Childeric, king of the Franks. Childeric will crop up again as a prime inspiration for Napoleon in terms of appropriating these same kinds of golden bees to give him the idea of even greater power in his perceived realm. In the Journal of Hellenic Studies, A.B. Cook writes about a phenomenal find in a Sardinian grave linked to bees symbolizing the immortal soul, as was the earlier discovery of the gold bees of Childeric that we just looked at. I think the most astounding part of this is in the middle passage. A bronze statue of a young man with braided hair came to light. 5 bronze bees symmetrically arranged on his breast. And then this boldface, by the way, is mine in both places. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that here is a reference to the bee of immortality, if not incarnation. The general impression produced on the mind of the average Greek must have been that the bee was a chthonian, an underworld creature, connected with, if not actually embodying the soul. Here we see some Minoan bee art. This was particularly prevalent in these kinds of winged bee goddesses in the Rhodes area of Crete, Greece, during the Minoan and the Mycenaean periods. It might seem strange to us to connect insects with the divine, but bees feature not infrequently in Greek myths, and again, very iconic imagery as well. The fundamental structure behind this was celebrated in ancient Greek celebrations of the Melissae, the oracular bee nymphs during this period in Greece. again, specifically the Minoan, that was very rich in bee goddess imagery. The Melissae were divine messengers, conduits for prophecy, speakers of divine truth. And when I'm searching for passages like this, I go through some of the texts on my shelves, the shamanic way of the bee, the sacred bee specifically. Not only heathens are bee fans, but here's a bona fide Catholic saint, the medieval Saint Abigail or Saint Gobnate. It's an old Irish belief that the souls of the dead leave the body as butterflies or bees. And bees have long held a place in Irish culture. Ancient laws were called bee judgments. And since Saint Gobnate was known for her care of the sick and healing people, she reputedly used honey, well known for its curative properties. The Irish love stories, Blarney, right? And one of Gobnate's attributed miracles has her rousting her bees from their hives in order to chase off a bandit and a rich man who wanted to build a castle on her farm. We see tribute to her, and of course the iconic bees symbolizing her outside of a church that was built later, but supposedly with remains from her beehive-shaped hut. This is much later from the 11th century. She was 6th century. And in the middle, 1914, Harry Clark's design that at the very bottom that we can't see it supposedly depicts this story of St. Gobnate's bees chasing off these bandits. Some accounts quite marvelously, I think, have her bees miraculously changing into soldiers and their hives transformed into bronze gold helmets. More bee iconography. Francesco Stelluti, first drawings of bees based on his microscopic observations, combining the earliest illustration of a subject seen through a microscope with a Latin poem complimenting Pope Urban VIII. Beneath that are some heraldic emblem type images of bees that speak to its association with popes and the Pope's own Barberini, rather, family, the de Medicis, and of course, Napoleon. Napoleon made sure that bees were an important symbol at his imperial court when he was crowned. Clothing, fabric, the coronation dress, scattered, and the ermine robes of his Empress Josephine, scattered with bees, furniture, glass, any kind of housewares to which he could add bees, it seemed he did. He apparently ignored the idea that bees might be related to a queen's, not a king's reign, however, but he found them a very appropriate symbol for empire. Napoleon was a pretty canny marketing maverick. He knew creating the illusion of power could amount to the same thing, that perceived power was power, and that the bee was a more iconic classic symbol of antiquity than the traditional French fleur-de-lis. He also thought because bees were a symbol of the Merovingian kings, this would give him added legitimacy to his role as emperor. In linking bees to royalty, Napoleon, or someone on his staff, must have been referencing the 1658 discovery of the tomb of Childeric that we just looked at. That among numerous items placed around his remains, the gold head of an ox, supposed to be an image of the idolatrous worship of the deceased, and piles of gold and silver, 300 little bees of the purest gold, their wings inlaid with a red stone like carnelian. I can't resist teaching art history. Just a little aside about this Jacques-Louis David portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Again, he was a great self-marketer. And the way that he connected his passage here to that of Bonaparte, you see at the stones at the lower left, under Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, is inscribed Hannibal and Charlemagne. This journey did not resemble theirs at all, however. The fact that Napoleon did not actually lead his troops over the Alps, but in fact followed them a few days later on the back of a mule, did not seem to disturb him at all in terms of appropriation. And appearably from his coronation decorations and the bee mentioned, the carnelian. This is the only other frame that I'm showing of a hive that I had. It's just an iPhone photo out side. And it certainly looks to me like something that could be part of Napoleon's house. So if we think again of this reference to Childeric and the linking of bees with the soul and the spirit, we find during this period and following many other instances and attributions. And I think it also speaks to the way that many of the artists, thinkers will look at Steiner, Joseph Beuys, look at their interaction with and reverence for, in some cases, bees. Bee coin, not Bitcoin, just to be a more pedestrian and colloquial, New Zealand's honoring of a coin. If we had the heads of emperors on coins, such as Napoleon, and there actually was a Napoleon coin, and coins served as a way, as they did, to broadcast an emperor's face to a colonized population in Africa and in other areas, regions, countries, continents that that emperor would never visit, we can see that's quite appropriate, I think at least, that perfectly appropriate that the honeybee should deserve a place on a crown. And we can't forget, of course, New Zealand's splendid Manuka honey. A quick true or false. If the bee disappears from the earth, mankind would have 4 years to live. Anybody know this quote? No? Anybody out there? Well, I have to say that unfortunately, as much as I would like that to be true, it's not. We don't think that Albert Einstein ever said that. Genius as he was, science history, not so much his area. There is no such thing as just the bee. There's over 20,000 species of bees. And there are other bees, carpenter, bumblebees, native bees that are also responsible for pollination. US Department of Agriculture estimates that about 1/3 of the human diet is derived from insect and other bats, hummingbees to a small degree, pollination. The honeybee is responsible for 80% of that pollination. That's still quite a lot. So it's true that the honeybee is a major pollinator of the world's crops, but it's also true that if we had to, we could live without them. If you want a diet of Velveeta and Spam, because if we don't have the bee anymore, there's not going to be a lot of stuff growing. 2, unique among all God's creatures. Yes, only the honeybee improves the environment and does not prey on any other species. Just think about the things they do that are positive for us. What you can do is encourage people not to confuse bees with yellow jackets, for example. Yellow jackets, of course, are going to be after somebody's hamburger on a plate. Never, almost never, a bee. They're non-carnivorous. 3rd, the hive is an apothecary. Absolutely true. The Egyptians used propolis, bee glue, as we call it, to embalm their cadavers, as they were quite acquainted with its putrefactive properties. Anti-fever reduction was a purpose the Incas used propolis for. Greek and Romans used it. Antiseptic, healing. Propolis was listed as an official drug in the 17th century London pharmacopoeias. And an illustration from that time that shows an early dissection of the bee. Getting into art in just a moment, I do have to say that if we're looking at the hierarchy of the hive, it only belongs in one place, and that is to the queen. Drones do not survive mating. I don't know if everyone knows that. Several drones mate with the queen in mid-flight at a time, and drones are not going to be one of the survivors of that process. So bees, their habitats and byproducts have long been inspiration, metaphor, symbol, material, and traditional and contemporary artwork. The work of the artists we're looking at here involves examining, manipulating bee environments, using hives and bee products as vehicles to explore crossroads of art and science, investigate natural and artificial boundaries, the nature of positive and negative space, instinctual behavioral patterns, and those subjected to constraints. Many of these artists use beeswax and honey in ways that highlight their metaphoric, luminous, and malleable qualities. Agatha Dyke, one of the artists we'll look at, created something called braille boards. The wax on them was changed and responded to the warmth of visitors' hands. So, as stated earlier, bees represent this inherent duality, simultaneously sweet yet scary. This dichotomy is also represented in the way that we consider internal and external in these artworks. The pedestrian busy as a bee, counterpointed by the mysterious womb-like world of the hive. And going back to our illustration here, the bee colony metaphorically, collectively, functions as a model for societal collaborative unity. Although since the hive is, of course, a matriarchal monarchy with an entourage of ladies in waiting who ditch the drones once they've outlived their purpose, it's a very female-centric world. This is an early illustration, 1270. These are not uncommon to that time in terms of the depiction of bees and relative size. Skeps, of course, were the traditional homes, hives for bees, more natural to them, quite unlike the Langstroth rectangular hives we use today. We also use Warren and top bar hives, but none of them have these rounded shapes. Cupid, Albrecht Dürer's Cupid, the honey thief, the image that I've used on my frontal piece here, and Bruegel's, or Bruegel's as he is sometimes called, The Beekeepers, 1567. This is often interpreted as not just mysterious faceless figures stealing honey. It's been viewed as a commentary on sociopolitical 16th century social issues, depicting attacks on beehives of Flemish churches stripped of their clergy, the bees, and content, the honey. A century later, an English minister, William Mew, who made one of the first observation beehives, wrote and preached on the bee's model as an antidote to 17th century social ills and the Civil War ripping apart Britain at that time. Agatha Dyke. Agatha Dyke is an 83-year-old artist in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who often works with found objects. Early on, she worked with buttons, a lot of secondhand junk shop work. She's best known in the past 15 or 20 years for her sculptural work with honeybees, building honeycomb on objects that Agatha introduces into their hives or apiaries, and as she says, are liberated by what they build together. Her interest is also in the intercommunication between species, in this case, humans and honey, and the sound communication, the ramifications of honeybees disappearing from the planet as well. So we'll look at a variety of these sculptures that Agatha makes along with the bees by placing these objects into the hives after she has slightly manipulated them. She may add some honey, she may add some wax to them, and then she inserts them into the hive and lets the bees go at what they transform. So these sculptures become rather fantastical. Everyday objects, such as a football helmet or a wedding dress, that are anonymous in a sense in terms of a social representation, become singular, one-off objects. This is her wedding dress. She works with a lot of what she calls junk shop Victorian ceramics. And it seems that the bees take to these as well in terms of the way that they add to them. That one I think is really quite something, the frilled collar. So So again, this idea of common signifiers of a well-functioning society. This is the kind of subject matter that Dike is interested in investigating and transforming, as she says, along with the bees, into something else, and something that can take on a significance to the viewer that may be akin to an object in a museum, and an ancient urn, perhaps. She has said, I'm studying the bees' use of the Earth's magnetic fields, as well as their use of the pheromones, the chemicals they produce to communicate with one another, with other species, perhaps man, and possibly with the foliage they pollinate, in her making of these objects something that is both worldly and unworldly. Shoes, skates. Now, bear with me. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to hear just maybe 2 minutes of Aganetha in her own words. I will also say that her work, particularly her early work, she was born into a Mennonite family, spoke with the way that she worked with commonplace objects, such as Button's kitchen items, spoke to her middle-class life in a very rural area of Canada, as well as to her Mennonite upbringing.
The bees have the skills of an architect. It's their ability to construct up, down, into dimensions. You know, that interested me. I mean, they create the most beautiful environment I've ever seen. I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous. You have to be an artist to be able to do that. Oh, look. Well, this is exciting. I'm not sure what our roles are. If we're so meshed in what we do, the bees and I, they work by instinct and I work intuitively. And I'm trying to figure out whether there's a difference. I feel close to them when I'm working in the hive because of the warmth they emit and the sound. They seem to be such a caring community. I'm really concerned for them. 95% of wild honeybees have disappeared. When you're so close to a creature that's so important to the world, and you know how quickly they could disappear and what that would do to humanity, that's a relationship that's pretty precious.
Anyway, I am a big fan of Aganetha's, and she has been a joy to have communicated with over the past few years. She also creates these drawings, and the bees, let's say, apply their own materials to them. She works with a number of other everyday objects, such as hangers. This is her Mennonite house. Some of her exhibits have turned a gallery into an apiary. This is always a tricky thing, let me tell you. It's not easy to figure out, in which visitors have entered with wearing bee suits that they would get at the door. More housing, the Grafter's Shack. This is J. Morgan Puett's Grafter's Shack, which is a meditation on activity and tranquility. Again, a duality. In this shack, we find the history of bee grafting and symbolism. Their workstations spilling over into books and manuals and various beekeeping tools. The hum of hives outside permeates the interior of the shack. It's an installation piece, and it's about how artists, designers, and beekeepers' workshops and studios are all sites of artisan, handmade practice rather than mechanical production. Puett created a textile and beekeeper's outfit based on bee lore or bee stories that refers to her sister, Barry Puett, who works as a queen bee breeder. Her brother, Garnet Puett, an artist and beekeeper, we'll look at some of his work in apisculpture a little later down, has given talks on contemporary beekeeping. And also poems that her other sister Lake has written on the childhood memories of these fourth generation beekeepers, all four of them. In The Philosopher's Stone, Barbara Bartos explores the live alchemy of the hive. She places two human brain-shaped containers made of clear polyurethane on two beehives. The bees access the containers in which they build honeycomb and store honey through acrylic tubes. This brain examines the bee's role as natural alchemist, transmuting a common substance into a prized one, fulfilling the tenet, therefore, of the Philosopher's Stone. This theory of alchemy is also that its fulfillment bestows a spiritual aspect upon and to the alchemist herself, let's say. Another brain honeycomb, gird yourselves here. This is Pierre Huyghe. I saw this piece, Reclining Female Nude, years ago, I think in LA. It was recently acquired by the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA in New York, and it resides in its sculpture garden. It's a concrete female nude, obviously, with a living beehive for its head, and by extension, her brain. Huyghe is referencing here the collective thought process, the idea of hive mentality as it relates to human political and social organization. And this is a hive that is seasonally maintained. Another apisculture artist, Tomas Libertini, bust of the iconic Nefertiti, a queen bee, of course, who reigned alongside her husband, the pharaoh Akhenaten, the self-defined Sun Ra king. Remember how they concocted a religion, if you know anything about Egyptian history, basically based on their own fabulousness, their own religion, the subjects worshiped them. They were like, you know, the Kanye West and Kim Kardashian of their time. At any rate, Rotterdam artist Tomas Libertini, who started working with bees and his Made by Bees in 2005, was inspired enough by Nefertiti to spend 2 years building a new queen, starting with a 3D model and then having 60,000 bees. That would be a very robust hive, more like 2 hives, build on it. First shown as a live installation 2 years ago. And more recently, actually in January 2000, of this year, there was a sort of mini showing of it. The early part of it in 2019 was interesting because it was a live installation. The bees were still working, as you can see on the left, so that visitors had a chance to see them build the piece. Libertini, like many other artists, is fascinated by this idea of the simultaneous, again, duality, durability, and malleability of beeswax. These kinds of sculptures can last thousands of years in the proper environment. So Egyptians had the right idea with mummification. This duality contradiction between fragility and endurance is something a number of artists explore. There's also this issue here of introducing live bees into a museum setting, actively dismantling the institution's perception of safety. While the organization and containment of the museum structure itself would seem to ensure safety, bee behavior, in fact, cannot be completely controlled. And therefore, it represents that unpredictable, or some would say potentially destructive side of nature. Jumping back to Aganatha just for a minute with her very whimsical crocheted figure as we lead into Esther Trageau and her little snuggly bee sweaters. In her work with honeybees collected from local hives, found, of course, not harmed, she introduces a dialogue about the natural world and its survival, and addresses man's instinctual and competing tendencies to both nurture, manicure, and control, subjugate nature. Her process gilds these natural objects with manufactured thread that she then hand dyes and crochets. The fiber is so snugly wrapped around portions of the bee, it gives the appearance that it's almost an integral and naturally occurring part of the bee itself. This laborious act is one of both protection and veneration, a way of preserving objects, bees once alive, and extending their lives beyond the evolutionary stage. again, it's a piece that evokes a sense of fragility, vulnerability, and of course, comfort, the idea of domesticity, knitting, a kind of tender trope of maternal nurturance, as well as an environmental message. What Trageau does is the opposite of reductive of the dwindling bee populations. It's a way of trying to maintain it. So you can see that these are scattered, one might say, all throughout a gallery wall. They're very carefully adhered to that. And then they are under sort of a glass bell. And here's some drawings that she's made because she works with other objects from nature. So these simultaneously look like, I think, bees and seeds, but they're very sweet. No pun. Gail Stevens disappeared. This is the tintype process. This is an archaic and not terribly expensive in its time compared to other forms of photographic production. And it's seeing a bit of a revival, as are many of what they call alternative, but are actually classical. I think it's a contradiction in terms, photographic process. So in 2013, Stevens, Gail, who's in Chicago, began creating exhibitions of multiple series of wet plate tintypes of dead found bees in wall installations. She places the bees directly onto the plates. Then as the exposure is processing, she sprinkles on more bees. So some images look more like bees are still moving, and others as if they contain a kind of ghost bee. The sizing of these, she's willing to make them any size, ranges from about 6 inches up to about 20 inches. And they're sometimes hung in a random, a less symmetrical order across gallery walls or even in a circle. In the exhibit here, she also produced a number of 2x2 tiny tintypes of dead bees. And these were clustered on a wall. They were also stacked on a table. Visitors could participate in the exhibit by buying one of these tiny tintypes, with each purchase making a honeybee disappear from the gallery. So kind of echoing this idea of promoting awareness of bee survival. More up close bees, that's one of Gail's, one of the tiny tintypes that you could take home with you, the 2x2s. More up close bees, Sandy Fellman's highly magnified, sepia-toned close-ups portraying the bees as both shadowy and kind of monumental, maybe even a little bit menacing. So there again, a duality. More close-ups, the marvelous Irving Penn's Bee Lips, which just went for quite a high price. It's like 120 pounds, I think, at a British auction. We're looking at the way bees are pollinating in some of these slides as well. There's a terrific PBS program, Tales from the Hive, in which cameras, endoscopic cameras are attached to bees, and we see them in the lower frame mating. And it was really the first film that had such close-ups of bees in flight and as they traveled. Pollination, I think an absolutely beautiful photo of pollinating bee. And there are the bees collecting bee bags. The pollen is passed from the mouth and the front legs to the back legs and into these little bags that fit very snugly on the bee. If the bee were flying faster, it's probably flying about 15, up to 15 miles an hour, and as far as 5 miles from home. At about 20 miles an hour, I believe it's estimated, then the pollen might start to fall. just some of the many myriad different kinds of plants and the colors that go into pollen making in the hive. Wolfgang Leib, a German artist with a field of rice. This is actually about a basketball-sized field of piles of rice punctuated by pollen. And then to the right, just a very sort of a spiritual, as he says of his work, use of pollen as kind of paint and palette simultaneously. The beautiful handmade film that took Stacy Steers 5 years to make. It's part photo montage. It utilizes a really beautiful soundtrack and includes silent film actresses and the early cinematic sequences that she cuts and pastes, highly detailed, laborious handwork, printing these film frames and recontextualizing the action. So she's hand building collage environments from fragments of 19th century film engravings, illustrations. And I'm going to speed through this. It's a 3-minute clip, but I'm just going to show you a few relevant parts. I think it's quite astounding, mesmerizing. So I'm cutting out of that. I'll also mention that this kind of surreal epic upends Mary Shelley's Frankenstein if you didn't get that part. So that is part of it, its contemporary undercurrent, as well as this idea of a hive collapse being part of an ongoing issue. So some of my favorite bee work is that of the highly innovative Mark Thompson. As you see, the bull's carcass to the right, his appropriation of Verville's Georgics, initiates his study of this idea of the concept of negative and positive space, as does his insertion of his head, as you see on the far left, into a plexiglass hive for several hours a day, several days a week, as a form of immersion in this kind of a hive. As he describes it, a self-described playing field. It's a uniform rectangular grid instead of a free-form honeycomb. So his work is playing off of and referencing the relationship between the human figure and the hexagonal honeycomb shape. Since the 1970s, he's been working with bees. He also has a phenomenal bee library and is a beekeeper, exploring the dynamics of the natural world, almost specifically through bees. And he is one of the artists whose hallmarks, as I mentioned before, are just this sheer sensual aesthetic pleasure in warm honey and wax, reminiscent of the seminal artist Joseph Beuys. The texture of pollen, the steady drizzle of honey, the movement around a hive and its reassuring hum. And Thompson's investigations of this kind of duality extend to political and sexual boundaries, freedom constraint, again, as mentioned before, negative, positive space. This installation, first installed in West Berlin in 1989, A House Divided, on the cusp of the wall's fall, investigated power structures as well as ideas surrounding duality, dialectics of the fall of the wall, the internal, external, old, new, east, west, male, female. The surrender of an old archetype and its folding into another can also be, a more hopeful one, can also be seen as representative of the kind of harmonious social order in bee world that both philosopher Rudolf Steiner, founder of the Waldorf school system, or his theories at least, and artist Joseph Beuys associate with the hive. So incorporating an earlier installation that was Live in Hive, A House Divided here was situated in a 19th century psychiatric hospital bordering the Berlin Wall. And he started off with a 19th century bee hunting box, and then transferred it to this glass immersion box inside the hospital where the bees were funneled to outside, theoretically, both sides, east and west, bringing back pollen from both sides of the wall, and these being processed inside in this glass wall box. The next phase of the installation consisted of transferring those bees to the carcass, situated under a skylight, which really sort of beautifully illuminated the installation. Thompson only had natural light. He had comb, beautiful golden comb, in the room where the carcass was. And then the idea was that the bees would hopefully establish a larger hive in the carcass. A single chair in a corner acted as a witness to this unification and transformation. Garnet Pewitt, mentioned before in the context of his sister, another apiculturist. Oh, I should also mention about Thompson's work that there was also this beautiful, very faint soundtrack of the cries and chants of Yugoslavian beekeepers used to call their bees back into the hive, which is not uncommon in many traditional beekeeping societies. So Pewitt is here again working with this idea of negative positive space, and establishing a bust that the bees are then building on. Karsten Holler and Rosemary Trockel. This is an installation, an outdoor year-round at a winery that also has been exhibiting art for longer than anywhere I've known of, contemporary art, for at least 25 years, in northern Italy. And they are investigating, they started this in 2001, and it's still there, and they still sell the honey these hives produce on site. They're investigating and manipulating through the use of these kinds of non-traditional hives that were inspired by this very forward-thinking winery's gravity-fed, what's called a vinification tower, non-traditional way of making wine. They're looking at a non-traditional way of making honey. So they have 7 here, brightly colored. They're iron and ceramic spheres. And they're trying to determine with this configuration, the effect of non-traditional hives on honey production. Alexis Rothman has this kind of psychedelic take on bee world, painter who is often investigating the potential effects of environmental harm to bees, as well as to other aspects of our environment. Catherine Chalmers, this is from her Imposter series. Catherine disguises cockroaches as various other beings, let's say. So here, these are the bees These are cockroaches disguised as bees, quote unquote. I have watched her make these, and it's a very interesting construction. So again, it's this idea of duality. And here it's not just the duality of inner outer, for example. It's not just sweet, scary. It's the duality of kind of icky, creepy, and something warm and fuzzy like bees, a sweet bee versus a cockroach. There is a sound artist, Mia Masaoka, who works with this, who is also an artist working with cockroaches, sorry to say. Maggie Taylor and Deborah Harmon just bespoke a little take on bee dresses for girls. Deborah Heyman is a girl series, she's a painter, and who focuses on this kind of trajectory of young girls' lives. And the idea here, if you can look closely on the right, the bee is actually navigating as though it were stitching this girl's dress from lower to upper. And this flight pattern is meant to suggest a sort of dizzying arrays of choices and experiences that can be part of a young girl's road to maturity. And because these are quite large scale, this is about 70 by, I think 48, something like that. They're meant to make us slightly uncomfortable. They're kind of in your face. And she's also painting, obviously in a very flat one-dimensional style. Seminal Joan Jonas, who is still out there making work. This is her, part of her Assume Astrid visual focus. This was part of the Whitney Biennale's 2005 show. And very much in line of her, this is her organic honey performance art alter ego figure. So both performance art and video from an era when a lot of documentaries were being made of performance art. The Waggle Dance, Diana Thader has these flitting bees, a video across a wall. And she is working with this idea of Carl von Frisch's theories about bees that he documented in his book, The Dance Language and Orientation of Bees, about the Waggle Dance. If we're thinking about the idea of 4 dimensions, that has since been extended by some to the idea of bees working in 6 directions, he's correlating the runs and the turns of the Waggle Dance as it happens to occur, which is that it corresponds to the distance and direction of the sun to the food source from the hive. So the dance's orientation is corresponding to that distance, again, from sun to food source. And the waggle portion of the run, there's supposedly 2 different kinds, one more energetic than the other, is correlated to this distance from the hive. And the more vigorous the dance, supposedly the better the food. When performing the Waggle Dance, as it's called, bees are communicating information in multiple dimensions. So reading this dance has been equated to processing information on 4 to 5 to even 6 quantum fields, which is sort of beyond me in the physics sphere. Mark Thompson, again, his Waggle Dance consisted of city explorations, going through a neighborhood, navigating, and his experiences with people along this pathway developed a portrait of that neighborhood. The Waggle Dance, a dance video spoofing early modernism, 1985, in which an unwitting drone turns a worker bee into a queen, and what ensues. It actually was quite well done. A Bessie Award is it's like the Oscars of the dance world, and this won that year. Mia Masaoka, she's, if you look at her online CV, she's astounding, pages and pages, really interesting musician, composer. She has worked with not only bees on her live body, as you see in the middle, but on the lower left, really icky, hissing Madagascar cockroaches. What I find most interesting about her is the way that she has determined as a composer that 3,000 bees vibrating their wings in unison create a pitch of middle C, and that they also synchronize their wings to certain rhythms. So I wonder, is there a bee conductor? This particular performance on the left was called Bee Project 31, Performance with Live Bees, and was created to investigate how bee sounds relate to human sound and how the hexagonal comb shape affects sound organization in the hive. Comb in the hive does a lot of things. It's also kind of the liver of the hive. It cleans it out from toxins, and it also is the ear. It deals with sound vibrations. One of her other works, Bee Project number 5, had 8 simultaneously channels set up to create a beehive sound environment. I don't know if anybody remembers Colin Turnbull's The Forest People, a very beautiful book from a few decades ago, quite a few, I think 1960s. The honey sounds of the Congolese Mbuti during the tribe's 2-month honey hunting season were documented in that. And Turnbull talks about the festive celebration songs during which the men sing the honey song and the women buzz, and it represents a place where spiritual and material worlds merge. Bee Opera in New Orleans. Christopher Wren, 17th century architect who designed St. Paul's Cathedral in London, is also known for designing one of the first wooden bee box hives. Like the hive hexagonal form, this was not as well, this octagonal form was not as well received by the bees. During this time, skip hives were still the most common, most in use hive. And wild bees can inhabit hollow trees and other sorts of enclosures, but this did not work so well for them, so it was not a productive idea. These round structures seem to be amenable to bees clustering in a ball in winter, which they do to keep the queen warm. And also kind of unrelated, when they're swarming, a bee swarm is about the gentlest thing that you can experience. You can just flutter it down with your hands like feathers, because the bees are just balled to protect the queen. They're not going to leave her because they're leaving the hive and they're going off to make a new home. The honeycomb house was a rejuvenation of the famous Frank Lloyd Wright's residential architectural career. This was built in 1937 on the Stanford campus in California. The Bee Hotel was at PS1, MoMA's outpost in New York. And as you can see, it has visitors climbing into cells. It had 23 emerging artists featured with videos, and there were private experience of those. Stephen Petronio, a well-known dancer, choreographer, and Janine Antoni, well-known artist, Honey Baby dance collaboration. A little bit more architecture. La Ruche, the Beehive, was an urban artist residence in Paris, 1902. Chagall, Modigliani, Rousseau, many artists are affiliated with this. It has a hexagonal structure and a central lobby and ateliers radiating out from that. And we see on the far right, same period, 1902, 1905, La Maison du Mille. There were many honey and bee shops in Paris and in other European capitals at that time. And this is the oldest, and that's the bee tile floor from there. Bee School, 2004, an ingenious, innovative adaptation of economical bee space, which is a term used for frames in the hive distance, used in a British primary inner school. Honeycomb-shaped classrooms wrap around the desks and they connect to outdoors. And students use this central social hub during the day, and it was used by the public at night. Some beehive huts, pouliazés truly, as they're called. telling the bees, this idea of sharing the demise of someone, most commonly the keeper of the hive, so that the bees wouldn't be too upset and they could adjust to that. A lovely poem by John Greenleaf Whittier about that. Many bee poems, just stopping to read, and Antonio Machado, marvelous poet. And the golden bees were making white combs and sweet honey from my old failures. Beautiful essay on hives, redolent of anther, pistil, petal, and nectar. Each cell came painstakingly into being when fairy tongues and feet molded thousands of tiny flakes as they emerged from the upper abdomens of gold and black honeybees. Margaret Atwood, Sylvia Plath wrote many poems about bees. Disappearing bees. This is a concern, of course, in many parts of the world. Here in northeastern Turkey, the beekeeping traditions of the Hemshin people originating in Armenia, an ethnic minority, are both evolving and at risk of vanishing. And they sustain this very distinctive custom of black hive beekeeping, hollowed out hornbeam tree logs. Traditionally, hives were managed by the men, but that custom is now changing, and Hemshin women, such as Özlem Erol, who also runs an artisan studio employing local craftswomen who are creating contemporary pieces out of traditional designs, is one of those women. And I think she looks quite saintly here. Maybe she's like the new Saint Gobnight. To her left is some chestnut honey, which is a very bitter, not particularly sweet honey from one of her hives. And she is part of an effort to sustain local culture against exploding tourism. So things like zip lines and whitewater rapids that are not germane to any sort of local cultural traditions or intruding here as they are in many other places of the world. A beehive carved out of a half log. This is Civil War era. Carved from a log, there's a solid top that detaches at the shoulders and bees enter through the belt buckle. Originally, it was blue washed by carpetbaggers to make it more PC to Northerners, new Northerners in the South. Such log hives, of course, relate to what we just looked at, part of an Eastern European tradition that would often carve human or bear figures into logs that bees claim for hives. Disappearing bees. Since 2006, the country's remaining domesticated bee colonies have declined about 30%. Colony collapse is responsible for at least a third of these. 50 million bees, more than 7 times the world's human population lost during the 2018-19 winter, more than 1/3 of commercial US bee colonies. Here we're looking at some ingenious Vietnamese bees. Beekeepers know that bees use propolis to shellac intruders into the hive like mice. Now it's known that they also use tools coating the hive entrance with dung. Might be chicken, might be anything that they find outside to repel intruders. So disappearing bees are also part of the photographer couple, the Park Steiner's Bee Season series, magical realism, along with similar photos that address Rudolf Steiner's, the Austrian philosopher's, mystical ideas about bees and bereavement at what we're losing in nature. Steiner himself might look right at home in a Park Harrison photo. Philosopher, scholar, architect, artist, educator, again, is the individual who Waldorf educational programs are based on. He founded Anthroposophy, a movement based on the idea that there's a spiritual world accessible to pure thought through self-development. Ardent fans of bees, deeply believed in he was rather an ardent fan of bees and was wrote a book about them, gave lectures in 1963 to German workers in factories about them, 9 very famous lectures. And he thought that they represented an age ripped apart by the industrial age, causing a disharmony where workers are busy, but in an unnatural way. And he also anthropomorphized the hive as if it were a human being. Kind of strange concept, with the bees circulating like a body's blood cells. And biodynamic principles are based upon Steiner's teachings. Joseph Beuys, Honey Pump at the Workplace, seminal artist of the 60s and 70s, very much a disciple of Steiner's ideas. And his work was a lot about attempting to change the detachment and the coldness of modernism and minimalism. He focused on honey's energy and warmth, and he believed that an individual's creative power was connected to nature and could free us from societal restraints. He also believed that bees possessed a spiritual energy lost by human society, and he wanted to tap into this Stone Age honey hunters' shamanistic energy. As you see on the right, that was the earlier illustration we looked at. Can bees survive? Will they? Well, there are people who are trying to help them. This is a black lab, as you can see, Clinker, who since 2008 has been trained to sniff out American foul breed, which is a really nasty bacterial infection that can very quickly decimate a colony. There's a growing interest in how ecosystems function and encouraging signs of reconnection to natural designs and people trying to find a way to integrate that into their urban lives. Various groups in the 19th and 20th centuries characterize the honeybee as the antithesis of that, the antidote to the disjunction of an industrial age ripped apart by war and disharmony. And there are indications that the bees are saving themselves, and I would say by extension us. They're self-medicating themselves against the critical mass of environmental toxicity by consuming forest mycelium. Paul Stamets is the mushroom king. He is wearing his trademark traditional Hungarian hat made from mushrooms. And he has done a lot of research. He works with a lot of scientists spreading the message that mushroom extracts, specifically from woodland polypore mushrooms, can greatly reduce viruses contributing to bee colony collapse. Bees in the Pentagon. Bees have recognized, the Pentagon has recognized rather that bees' acute sense of smell, ability to track, makes them candidates for locating explosive chemical weapons, landmines, even drugs. They're very sensitive to molecular trails, and they're also being tested for their ability to screen airborne bacterial spores, such as anthrax. Here they are at a sugar water feeder after scouting explosive chemicals. I know it seems like one of those Alex Rothman paintings, but it seems that this is a promising path in terms of bees being seen as being more valuable. It's also been documented that a single exposure to a reward pair odor, single exposure, was enough for most forager bees to remember that specific odor the following day. Many foragers could even remember those scents 3 days later. Here is a beautiful straitjacket made out of bees' wings. So have we straitjacketed the bees? Have we condemned them to extinction? Are we just going to train them to be little worker bees, at the Pentagon or elsewhere? I would say that here's a radical proposition. Maybe we could have bees and book learning instead of bans in municipalities from people who want to be beekeepers. Maybe we should offer beekeeping in public schools. And that addition to the traditional curriculum could encourage kids and teachers to find ways to have a better appreciation of the natural world and to be taught skills for working with, managing, understanding our natural environments. We've seen the growth of a lot of outdoor learning initiatives, particularly with the pandemic this year. So you might also have a neighbor who insists on using chemicals and neonicotinoids, which have been shown to be quite damaging to bees, but whose rights take precedence. That takes me back to where we started. Well, of course, actual honey, all the honey's made overseas. A lot of what you get is not. Always look for the certification, as I can say, just with olive oil, you need to make sure what you're getting is what is on the label. Takes me back to where we started, the idea of the spirituality of bees. On his breast were 5 bronze bees symmetrically arranged. The idea that bees are a symbol of immortality, if not reincarnation. And I will add a final art literary reference. I'm a huge Samuel Beckett fan, and in his novel Malloy, one of the protagonists, Moran, is excited about coming home to see his bees do the waggle dance. And in true Beckettian fashion, of course, the bees are dead. He describes at length the mysterious buzzing waggle dance and how he had attempted to decipher and transcribe it earlier, only to realize he never could. And Moran is the character in Malloy who has a very scientific mindset. And he said, the waggle dance was controlled by, quote, determinants of which I had not the slightest idea, end quote. And then a little later he says, quote, and I said with rapture, here is something I could study all my life and never understand, end quote. I think that this passage is kind of wistful wondering, an almost happy, uncomplicated moment in Beckett, of all people, who so many people think of as gnarly, difficult, nihilistic. I think he's hilarious, that his character could find joy and have the sense of wonder and awe at something like a bee, encapsulates even Beckett's ongoing theme of the incomprehensible and the inherent contradiction in the innate inability in transcribing that which is impossible to describe. Certainly, I think this describes bees and life within the hive, certainly for a beekeeper, our wonder and marvel at these creatures and the gifts to us of what they make. Thank you. Sorry we ran over. I don't know if we have any time left for questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Doreen. Lots of information there. Quickly look at the chat box. There was one question there. With the decline of recent bee populations, what can communities do to help? And I guess Jean Davis had said, plant flowers, don't use insecticides, let lawns become full of low flowers. Anything else you want to add to that, Doreen?
Exactly. I mean, Jean's the master or the mistress of beekeeping. You don't have to be a beekeeper to be bee friendly, just that. And also think about ways that you can encourage your community to think about regulations. There are fewer here than in other more urban places. Bees are now, they've been in the White House for a few years. They've been on top of City Hall in Chicago for at least 15 years. I mean, there are some encouraging signs that people are realizing this is a positive part of our environment, and be aware of legislation in which you might be able to have a voice in bee protection and environmental protection.
Mary Elizabeth, do you want to ask a question to start off?
Okay, I'll just start at the beginning. I went in order of your program, so this is way at the beginning. You showed that wallpaper photo, the picture that you said you'd like to make into wallpaper. I wondered, does the hive really look like those colors inside?
Yeah,
I thought it was all sort of one color. I was really surprised when you said that, and I thought maybe I misunderstood.
That's pollen on comb in a frame. So if you were to see the edges, you'd see a piece of rectangular wood. There, if it's a full box, super. There would be 8 of those and 2 just thick boards, follower boards on either end. That will be capped with honeycomb, so that, and then you won't be able to see the colors, and then you will need to be able to distinguish it from larvae, from capped honey, from nectar when it's turning into honey in the hive. So when that is to say that when all these frames, the cells are capped, it's with the same, sort of light brown material. So you have to look closely in order to be able to discern what lies under that.
Oh, that's very interesting.
It is.
I just wondered, why don't the drones, well, I had 2 questions about them. Are are the drones that mate with the queen bee, are they special in some way, like bigger or something? And why don't they survive the mating?
They think they are, I'm sure. Sorry. When they mate, their quite frankly, their endophallus, when semen is ejected, rips out of their body, and they die in mid-flight.
Oh.
And even if they were still in the hive, if they got back to the hive, once they've done their work, which is inseminating the queen, that they do outside the hive anyway, they're just going to get swept out. I mean, when they're in there, the worker bees tolerate them. I mean, there are nurse bees or forager bees. Bees have, during their brief 6 to 8 week lifespan, they all have very different roles at different times. And they work themselves to death, during that brief lifetime. They're feeding them and they're cleaning their poop out of the hive. The drones don't do anything. They just kind of, loll around and, I don't know, watch sports or something.
How often?
That's all they ever do. Jean, do you have anything to add to that?
They eat a lot. They eat a lot, and they don't.
They eat a lot.
It's like the grasshoppers and the ants. They don't produce themselves, but they create genetic diversity in the hive world, so they're important. But when fall comes, the girls kick all the boys out and they freeze. They don't overwinter.
Oh.
Yeah, that's sort of it. But that's the continuity of the hive also, right? So
so there's no insemination over the winter then, because there are no males then. No. It just happens during the warm weather.
Right, but also the queen's not going to be flying then, especially in a climate like this. It's just not the seasonal trajectory.
The mating only happens once in the life of the queen. So when she's very young, she goes out on a couple mating flights, and then she's pretty much indoors the rest of her life unless the population decides to reproduce and cast off a swarm and divide it.
Oh, she only mates once? Wow.
It's over a
virgin flight.
Couple days, over a few days.
There's a virgin flight, and that's right. That's kind of it. And then she's just in the hive laying.
Wow. How many eggs does she lay? Like zillions?
She can lay 1,500 to 2,000 a day.
A day. It's phenomenal.
Oh my God.
A day. Like
wow.
A really healthy, robust queen. When a queen starts to fail, less.
Wow.
And then there are those amazing sounds. I've never heard them, Jean. Maybe you have. If there are new potential queens, and there's a difference in drone cells and queen cells. If you see that you're getting these kind of cupped queen cells that are not the same as the more flat, I guess we can describe them as within the more uniform cells, there's a keening, there's cries of the new queens, supposedly. I've never heard that when they are born, and then they will fight the queen to the death. And before that point is when that old queen may have swarmed, when the hive has decided collectively that they will leave with her.
So swarming.
Part of the hive, not all the worker bees, part of the hive leaves.
Right.
It's not a wholesale departure.
But it can be half the colony.
But it can be as much as half the colony. If it's a robust colony, like 50,000 bees.
Yeah.
Is it just because it gets too big? Is that mainly what drives it? Like it's too big and there's not enough pollen?
Yeah, if you haven't put enough supers on, if you're not paying attention as a beekeeper, noticing that your bees seem crowded or unhappy, that's one reason that they can swarm, and also that there's going to be a new queen emerging, and then they leave with the old queen.
But just in nature, if they're by themselves, do they do it because there's just not enough pollen in that area to support so many, and then part of them leave?
They have an urge to reproduce, and it's how that creature reproduces, is it reproduces as a whole conglomerate of individuals. So when they start to get a large population, their goal is to reproduce by splitting and half of them going and finding a new home in a new territory.
Oh, okay. I see.
Not the queen decide, like the queen is never going to decide. That is the nature of the hives, that it's that collective organism, and that.
So all this to reproduce, all this to make more, to get to a point, divide, go. get to a point, divide, go. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So I think I have a question here. So if they swarm and they go elsewhere, and there's a queen in that new location already, what then happens then? Is there a fight for who's going to take over that hive?
Oh, well, they're not going to, I mean, yeah, Jean, correct me. They're not going to populate a hive where there's already a queen.
Oh, okay.
That just never happens that I know
And
of.
the colony that leaves with the old queen.
Right. So that old queen is leaving. And that's why I was saying when you see a swarm, when people call, whoever they call their, to pest control, they're the most gentle because they're just bald to protect the queen. They're not going to detach themselves. And that's why you can so easily just like flutter them down like feathers into a box, a cardboard box, and to contain the swarm before you then transfer it to your own hive, to your own wooden boxes.
Okay.
There's a democratic process that takes place where they'll leave the hive and they'll like cluster on a branch somewhere and they'll send out scouts to find a good cavity somewhere to move into.
Right.
Then when the scouts find a couple different locations, then more bees go and check those locations out and they start to do the bee dance, getting more and more excited. And eventually it's like a voting procedure that they're more excited in cavity A than cavity B. And then all of a sudden the whole group moves over and moves into cavity A.
Yeah. And again, it's like a council. Those four groups come back and then a decision is made.
Interesting.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Doreen.
Hi. Hi there. How are you? Oh my God. Oh my God. That's my
Andy.
cousin.
Justin.
Seen forever. Oh,
I'm their cousin. I'm her cousin.
oh, there's my brother up there waving away and another one down there. Gosh,
No,
it's
I know. I see.
family.
So that was fascinating. I wanted to know, there's so many ancient civilizations, right, that have animal deities. And I don't remember or can't think of any that have bees. I mean, they're so integral to life, to food, right? To pollination and food.
Yeah.
Do you know of any civilizations or groups that ever deified bees like they did cats and ibises and all kinds of other creatures?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, the early early Minoan cultures, the Greek cultures, early Anglo-Saxon shamanic bee rituals and matriarchal bee worship was very much a part of those early religions. Other parts.
Okay, well, maybe you mentioned it. I came in late. I was working. So.
Oh, sorry. There's a lot going on there. Yeah. So Greece and early Anglo-Saxon are the two that come to mind where I think that activity was was quite prevalent.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. So good to see her.
I think we may just end right here. I want to thank you, Doreen. Really fascinating topic, and I was very excited for this. So thank you for sharing that with us.
And I want to thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Thank you all. Really, a lot of stuff. I know. At least you're not getting quizzed on it, right?
And I want to thank everybody for being here with us again, and hope to see you at the next lecture. And don't forget, Frida Kahlo starts tomorrow.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to look for that. Thank you all. Good evening.
Have a good night.
Bye, Dora.